Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that pulls out the key knowledge from important sources you should know about. Today, we're digging into a really significant piece of scientific work. It's a huge collaborative paper that, frankly, exposes one of the major blind spots in how we manage invasive species globally.
Yeah, we're looking at pan-continental invasion of Pseudorasbora parva towards a better understanding of freshwater fish invasions. The lead author is Gozlan. But the really striking thing here is the sheer scale of it. You've got 28 experts involved across 31 different countries.
Wow.
That kind of international effort just to track one small fish tells you straight away this isn't just some minor ecological issue. It's a major problem.
And the fish itself is the topmouth gudgeon, Pseudorasbora parva. It's a little cyprinid, a carp relative from East Asia. But the paper argues it's maybe the most compelling fish invasion in the world. That's quite a statement.
It is. And the core reason it's so compelling and so worrying is that it was essentially an accident. The whole massive spread across continents, it was driven by accidental introductions. We're talking about a species that nobody intended to move.
The hitchhiker.
Exactly. A tiny stowaway, released without anyone really noticing, alongside the fish people were intentionally moving for business. And the result? In less than 50 years, basically since the 1960s, this fish has popped up in 32 countries. We're talking Central Asia, all the way to North Africa.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that. If it was unintentional and the fish is so small, how on earth do you even start mapping that kind of spread across, 31 countries? How did they, methodology-wise, how did they tackle mapping such a huge, almost hidden invasion?
Well, it was a massive job of pulling data together. And crucially, it relied heavily on local national expertise. That was key. They didn't just, look at the big international journals. They combined standard monitoring surveys with what's often called gray literature.
Ah, okay, like agency reports, local studies.
Precisely. National agency stuff, maybe university reports, unpublished government data. Things that don't always make it into the big databases. The goal was synthesis, to really quantify the key things. What were the pathways? How long did it actually take people to notice the fish was there? And what happened in that initial phase before the population really took off?
That focus on gray literature sounds vital. You capture that local knowledge that often gets missed in broader studies. But let's get into the mechanics. If it's spreading across continents, what was the main vehicle? How did it make those really big jumps?
The main long-distance mover was aquaculture. That accounted for something like 65% of the initial introductions. This fish was quite literally just swimming in the same water, in the same tanks, as bigger, more commercially valuable fish being shipped around.
Right. So if aquaculture was the big vector, why didn't the usual risk assessments pick up on this little hitchhiker? Were people just not looking?
Pretty much. The focus was entirely on the target species, the ones being bought and sold, mostly the big Chinese carps. Black carp, grass carp, silver carp, bighead carp. Those were the valuable fish being moved around, especially before the 1990s. This little gudgeon. It was just seen as, I suppose, insignificant contamination. Didn't seem like a threat.
And the timeline, you mentioned the risk management kind of failed. How fast did this thing actually establish itself once it arrived somewhere new?
The speed is, it's pretty sobering when you look at it. They found roughly 5 new countries reported having the fish every single decade. But here's the real kicker, the failure point. The average time between the fish first being introduced somewhere and it being officially detected by scientists or managers was 4.1 years.
4 years. That actually sounds kind of fast for spotting a tiny fish you weren't looking for.
It sounds fast, maybe, but biologically it was far too slow. That 4-year window, completely insufficient to stop the invasion from becoming pan-continental. The gudgeon reproduces quickly, it has short generation times, it was already setting up shop, establishing real permanent populations before anyone even officially noted it was there, and once it lands, then the secondary spread kicks in. That's mostly natural dispersal, just swimming, and that accounts for about 72% of the local spread.
Okay, so the human activity gives it the big leap across borders or continents, and then its own biology lets it spread locally using routes like, say, the River Danube, covering maybe 25 kilometers or so on its own. Did they find any other, maybe more unusual ways it got moved around?
They did. And it's a good reminder that invasions don't always need huge industries behind them. Sometimes it's just small-scale human actions. I mean, recreational fishing was a factor, about 22%, and the ornamental fish trade, maybe 9%. Minor, but still there. But they also found these really interesting cases like religious practices in Tibet, people buying live fish from markets and then releasing them back into the wild as an act of merit. Sometimes this gudgeon was among them.
Wow. That just shows how unpredictable these pathways can be, anything involving moving live animals.
Exactly. It highlights the complexity.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit from the logistics of how it got places to the biology of how it survives once it gets there. Surviving in such different places, you mentioned Mediterranean climates, continental, northern Europe, that requires a pretty special biological toolkit, right?
Mm.
What makes this little gudgeon such an ecological, well, chameleon?
Yet the absolute core biological finding is its incredible phenotypic plasticity. That's the scientific term. But basically, it means it can change its body and its lifestyle, its reproductive traits, to fit wherever it finds itself. First off, its reproduction. It's a small fish, remember, under 120 millimeters usually, and it matures really fast, often in its very first year of life, especially if it grows quickly and hits about 40 millimeters long.
So really efficient, fast turnover, quick generations.
Exactly. High efficiency. But here's a crucial difference compared to most other cyprinids, most other carp relatives. Parental care. They do what's called batch spawning. They reproduce multiple times in one season, and the male actually guards the nest, which is pretty basic, but he guards it. That protection dramatically increases the hatching success rate. So the female might lay up to 3,000 eggs in a season, and a much higher proportion of those actually survive because of the male's guarding.
Ah, that parental investment is a big advantage, especially when you're trying to establish in a totally new place. What about food? Is it picky?
Not at all. Highly adaptable there, too. It's generally classed as an omnivore or maybe a planktivore. It eats zooplankton, little crustaceans, insect larvae like chironomids, even just detritus, organic muck. But here's something really novel, kind of surprising, that the study highlighted. When these fish get really crowded at high densities, they can become facultative parasites.
Facultative parasites. Okay, break that down. What does that mean?
It means they don't have to be parasitic. It's not their primary way of life. But under certain conditions, like intense competition for food when they're packed together, they switch their behavior. They've actually been observed nibbling on the skin and mucus, sometimes even the muscle tissue, of larger fish in crowded aquaculture ponds, like the big carps they originally hitchhiked with.
Whoa. So it's not just competing for food. It can actually start feeding on other fish when things get tough.
Correct. It's a behavioral shift driven by scarcity. Turns this seemingly harmless little fish into something much more aggressive under pressure.
That's a serious survival tool. And you mentioned it copes with different water types, too.
Yep. Both lentic water, still water, like lakes and ponds, and lotic water, moving water, like rivers and streams. It's fine in both. And its physical form, its morphology, is really variable. It suggests local conditions have a huge influence on how it develops. Latitude seems particularly important. Where it lives determines things like how fast it grows and how big it gets before it can reproduce.
Okay, so it's tough, adaptable, reproduces fast. But let's get to the really hidden threat, the pathogens. This is where the story gets, well, frankly, quite alarming. A biological time bomb, as you put it earlier.
This is probably the most insidious aspect of this fish. Now, there's some support for what's called the parasite release hypothesis. In the places it invades, P. parva often has fewer types of its native parasites compared to back home in Asia, so it does leave some enemies behind.
Okay, that's typical for invaders.
Right. But its real advantage, the dangerous part, is its ability to pick up new pathogens in the invaded range and cope with them without getting sick itself. It shows no clinical signs. It becomes a healthy carrier, a reservoir for diseases that can devastate native species.
Like a Trojan horse, it brings the disease across the border or picks it up locally and carries it around without anyone realizing because the carrier fish looks perfectly healthy. What specific diseases are we talking about? What are the big ones they carry silently?
The paper highlights three major threats. First, there's pike fry rhabdovirus, PFR. This causes a really nasty acute disease in young pike, which is obviously an important sport in native fish in Europe. But P. parva carries it without any symptoms. It just acts as this constant, healthy source of infection for the pike.
Okay, so that directly links the invader to harm in native economically valued species. What's the second one?
That would be Anguilla crassus. This is a nasty parasitic nematode, a worm, that's been implicated in major declines of European eels. It causes high mortality. And P. parva can act as an intermediate host for this parasite. It helps the parasite complete its life cycle. They found infection rates in the gudgeon itself reached up to 35% in one study in France.
Wow, so it's facilitating the spread and impact of a parasite that's already hammering a critically endangered species like the European eel. Okay, and the third one, the rosette agent.
Yes, that's Cerithecum destruens. It's an intracellular parasite, kind of like a fungus or a protist. This one is really nasty. It's been directly linked to the decline, sometimes rapid decline, of other small native European ducks, especially the sunbleak, Leucaspius delineatus. The research strongly suggests that the arrival and spread of this particular pathogen in Europe might have been significantly helped along by the gudgeon acting as this stealthy transport system.
Good grief. So putting this all together, what does it mean for actually trying to control these kinds of invasions? You said the 4-year detection gap showed that the standard approach, rapid detection, rapid response, just completely failed here. Does this make managing invasions like this basically impossible?
It makes it incredibly difficult, bordering on impossible, once they get into large, interconnected open systems like big rivers that cross borders. The paper basically argues that traditional management is often just too slow for something this mobile and this accidentally introduced. The only times eradication has actually worked is in small, isolated, contained water bodies, lentic environments.
Right. You mentioned the UK using pesticides, fish poisons in isolated ponds. That worked because the fish couldn't escape.
Exactly, because the water was contained. But once this gudgeon gets into a major international river like the Danube, forget about elimination. It's just not feasible. And that's why the researchers really push for specific policy recommendations based on this reality.
Okay, what are those key things that policymakers need to focus on then?
They really push for 3 main developments. First, we need to think bigger than just local monitoring. We need early warning systems that operate across multiple scales, simultaneously global, continental, transnational, right down to the river basin level.
Okay, a more integrated, wider net.
Second, prioritizing really rapid eradication programs, acting immediately when it's first found before it gets the chance to spread naturally into those bigger open river systems. The window for effective action is tiny, maybe months. Definitely not the 4 years we saw was the average detection time.
And the third recommendation seems to hit directly on why the initial risk assessments failed for P. parva.
Yes, it stresses the need for specific risk assessments that look beyond just the species being intentionally imported. You have to specifically assess the plasticity of any hitchhiking species. How adaptable are they likely to be? And crucially, what pathogens might they be carrying or be susceptible to carrying? We can't just assume small fish are harmless contaminants anymore.
Makes sense. Looking forward then, how can scientists use this incredibly detailed case study of the gudgeon? Does it help advance the basic science of biological invasions?
Definitely. Because its spread is now so well documented across so many environments, P. parva becomes a fantastic model species. Researchers can use it to test fundamental theories in invasion biology. Things like coevolution, how does it interact with new parasites or predators, and also the alley effect.
Okay, remind us, what's the alley effect?
The alley effect is basically the idea that for some species, especially at low numbers, their population growth rate actually increases as their density increases. More individuals help each other out, find mates easier, maybe defend better. So there's a positive correlation between how many there are and how well they do, up to a point. The gudgeon, with its male parental care possibly being more effective in groups, or its density-dependent behaviors like that facultative parasitism, might be a really good example to study this.
Right. And finally, what's the really urgent message here for countries that are still involved in the kind of trade that kicked this whole thing off?
Well, this whole review really serves as a stark early warning, especially for countries that are currently importing those Chinese carps for aquaculture. The paper specifically mentions places like the USA, South Africa, India. The pathway, the vector, is still active. And the invader itself is proven to be highly adaptable, very stealthy with its diseases, and ready to take advantage. The risk hasn't gone away.
So the bottom line from this deep dive seems crystal clear. The P. parva story demonstrates powerfully that these accidental introduction routes, like aquaculture, when combined with a species that has high biological adaptability, high plasticity, and this ability to silently carry devastating diseases, well, it creates an invasion risk that's just much higher, much faster, and much harder to predict than our old risk models ever accounted for.
Absolutely. And maybe the final thought to leave you with, connecting this to the bigger picture, given how incredibly adaptable this fish is across such different climates, what we urgently need now is robust climate modeling combined with really detailed analysis of these introduction pathways. We need to predict where else it could establish as the climate changes. And maybe, just maybe, get ahead of the next pan-continental invasion before it even starts. So the challenge for all of us, I think, is to really consider those hidden disease risks that are quietly moving around the world right now in global trade, carried by species we might not even realize we're importing.
A very compelling and, yeah, a slightly unnerving challenge to end on. That wraps up this deep dive. We'll see you next time.